official, Furina, and now to complete the Great Project F trilogy, we will be covering the character who single-handedly raised Onuma carries to the top, everyone's favorite 100-year-old gilf, and we'll be going over her best builds and teams while also discussing all the misconceptions surrounding her. So this will be the definitive best guide on the enigmatic mechanist herself, Madame Faruzan. Hello there, Flip here, and today it's Hatsune Miku time. In this video I'm going to be talking about why Faruzan is so great, debunking any misconceptions surrounding her, and then looking at her best constellations, weapons, artifacts, and teams. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Now without further ado, let's get into it. So, to no one's surprise, assuming you've read the Granny's kit, the reason she's good is due to how she buffs Onuma damage by a lot through different sources. With her elemental burst, she'll display a polyhedron, a word I haven't heard since my secondary school math classes. This polyhedron will travel in a triangular path in quite a big radius, and whenever it reaches a corner, it unleashes a pulse that will do two things. The first thing it will do is decrease enemies' Onuma resistance by 30%, and depending on your talent level will increase your Onuma damage by up to 38%. Both of these effects will last 4 seconds after the pulse hits, which is important as this means that even though its uptime is 12 seconds, the buffs and debuff time will be 16 seconds at C0 and at C6 22 seconds. The Madame also has additional buffs through her A4, which is a nice flat bonus, but it's not worth gearing around. Oh yeah, and I guess Faruzan has an elemental skill. It doesn't really do much besides doing a lot of stagger and poise damage and also being a decent way to group enemies, which is quite nice. My favorite thing to talk about, misconceptions, in which two float around a lot when talking about Faruzan. One is that Faruzan has absurd energy requirements that can even reach 300%, and two is that Faruzan needs her C6 to be playable, and without it carries like Zhao and Wonder aren't that great. To first address energy issues, she does not need 300 ER, assuming you do her aim shot, which is what generates particles on both Wander and Zhao teams, she will never need more than 270, and this is at C0. If you say fuck her charge shot, then yes, you are looking at higher energy requirements, but the charge shot comes out very quickly and can be aimed at the ground near enemies, so you don't need precise aim for it. And I've honestly never understood why people complain so much that she needs to build high ER. What other stat are you building on her? Faruzan's damage, even when fully kitted out on support teams, would be so underwhelming compared to other off-field damage dealers. And unlike most other buffers, she doesn't need a stat for her buff, so you'd most likely only build ER anyways. With an energy recharge Sant and Favonius bow, which is free, most of your work is already cut out for you, and even less if you decide to use Emblem, so Faruzan's energy requirements aren't that bad, nor are they a massive issue when building her anyways. Let's move on to talking about her C6, and since it's a constellation, we may as well talk about all of them in the next section. Faruzan C1. It isn't that impactful, but I know you guys don't have aim nearly as good as mine, so if you miss her charge shot, it can be nice quality of life. You wanna know what's funny also? You would think that 2 arrows equals more energy, but Hoyo decided to give it an energy generation ICD of 5.5 seconds, so firing 2 arrows in a row won't net you any more energy than just firing 1. Getting onto an amazing constellation, C2 in my opinion is when you can pick up Faruzan and leave her if you want, as anything after is just a bonus. Her buff up time is now 22 seconds, which is quite long, and allows you to use her at the start of your rotations, whilst losing no buff up time, and this makes her more synergistic with Zyok's teams. Her C3, wow, elemental skill buff. Yay. To be fair, it is solid for her damage if you're building her for that, especially in conjunction with her C6. Constellation 4 gives you 2 to 4 energy depending on the amount of enemies hit by Faruzan's pressurized prolapse. And the thing about Faruzan constellations is that they make her other ones better, which reigns true here for her C4 because it makes her C2 better, because firing 2 shots back to back will result in 4 to 8 energy, depending on the amount of enemies hit. And it also makes her C6 better, which we can talk about now. Yes, the Granny C6 is one of the best 4-star constellations, which is why it's so heavily talked about. It gives Onuma characters a 40% crit damage boost, as well as any attack being able to trigger Faruzan's pressurized collapses, and these group generate 8 particles overall and will trigger Faruzan C4, reducing Faruzan's energy requirements to be at or under 200%, generating a lot of particles for your on-field Onuma unit as well as making applying her Onuma shred more consistent if your burst is out of reach. All this to say, yes, her C6 is very fucking good, but it is not at all a necessity. If you're looking to play Zhao or Wanderer teams, or hell, any Onimo carry for that matter, Faruzan still gives you a res shred and a damage bonus, which is more than any other support will be able to buff these characters. And at C2, if you have a decently invested Onimo carry, you should be able to dumpster the Abyss just fine. And the same damage impact you get from not having Faruzan C6 is actually equal to not having things like Xingqiu or Official C6 on their teams. So if you're holding Faruzan to the standard, then we also have to hold all the other ones you get a lot from Constellations too. And the reason I'm harping on this is because Wanderer and Zhao teams, and even Lynette and Hazer now, if you have Zhang Yun, are all strong units. And people who like these characters should know that even without having a C6 Faruzan, they can still build these carries now and they won't be wasted investments. Before Constellations, what ultimately matters is team and character building, and being able to compensate for what you lack. If you don't have a C6 Faruzan and don't hit the energy requirement, so have to delay your rotations, but with C6 Faruzan you do hit the RX on the same build, so the team runs smoother and you save about 10 seconds, sure, C6 helps there, but if you just built more ER, it could also have alleviated that same issue and made your rotation smoother. Do you have enough crit rate to consistently trigger Favonius? Can you slot out one of your teammates for more offense? These will also help you get a lot out of your Onimo carries. I just want to say again, I'm not trying to undermine how strong Faruzan C6 is, but her teams are more than viable even discounting it. But no more yap about her Constellations. Let's look at our Madame's weapon options. I'm gonna break this category in two sections, looking at both supportive and offensive weapons, and to no one's surprise, Favonius bow is most of the time going to be Faruzan's best supportive weapon, giving Faruzan a massive 60 energy and reducing the energy requirements for the rest of your team, which helps solo element units like Bennett, or just if you have Zhao. If your Faru is pre-C6, there's quite literally no other weapon you should be using, but if you have C6, Faruzan generates so many Onimo particles at C6 that even Zhao doesn't have an egregious energy requirement, taking Favonius away. And if the rest of your team meets their energy requirements, Elegy of the End has a high base attack for Faruzan's passive, and buffs attack by 20%, and because you do swirl a lot on Onimo teams, the EM funnily enough helps your damage by making your swirls hit harder. These are pretty much the only good supporting bows on Faruzan, so this is where this part of the weapon section ends, though if for whatever reason you want to see your Faruzan hit big funny numbers, and I want to stress this playstyle isn't very recommended, here is a weapon sheet for that. Don't ask why I made this, but unlike you, I actually have places to be, so I'll only keep it on screen for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, let's talk about our artifacts now. Faruzan's artifacts are also very straightforward. Well, not really straightforward, she just can't use that many sets, as she is an Onimo unit that isn't a damage dealer, that also doesn't want to run VV, and isn't a healer. So what do you run on her? Thank you, viewer, for asking. That's what I'm here for. If you're super lazy or don't have that many ER substats, just giving Faruzan 2-piece emblem and any mix of artifacts with the most ER will do just fine. It's actually kind of funny. But if your Faruzan is C6, then going with 4-piece tenacity is the best for team-wide damage, as the pressurized collapses count as skill damage and therefore trigger tenacity. Hell, if you wanted to maximize her personal damage, since her C6 counts as a skill proc, as I said, your best bet is to go with Golden Trope. And regarding Tenacity's older, bluer abandoned brother, Noblesse actually isn't that great on Faruzan. On most teams, there should just be a better holder, and since Faruzan uses her burst so early in rotations, and the carries she works with don't snapshot, you will just lose out on its effects. For main stats, as a support you want an ER Sans, any goblet that will give you the highest ER regardless of main stat, and a crit rate circlet if you're using Favonius. If you're using her as an off-field damage dealer, then attack or ER Sans depending on the team, Onimo goblet, and a crit circlet. To close this guide off, wait, it's not 20 minutes long. Let's discuss Faruzan's team options, starting with her strongest teams to her less strong teams, and explaining how she's built in these teams and what units to use in them. Faruzan's strongest teams are undoubtedly with Wanderer or Zhao, so let's start with Zhao teams. From the Zhao and Faruzan core, an issue you can run into with team building is there aren't actually that many options that are 100% synergistic with Zhao, due to his long field time requirements. However, he does have a team which uses both Jonin and Furina that buff him for his entire burst duration, and this is Zhao's best team currently. If you don't have access to Jonin, then your best bet is to actually substitute Jonin with Jean, keeping 3 Onimo units for extremely low energy requirements. On either of these triple Onimo teams, Faruzan does have quite a low ER need, on 155 without using a Favonius weapon, so you can build her for more damage if you want, though again the increase isn't usually worth it. And even though you lose some of Bennett's buff, you can still opt to use the Zhao, Bennett and Faruzan core, and other long uptime units like Furina or Zhongli can be slotted in here. Rotationally, you're almost always going to want to start with Faruzan as she has the longest buff uptime at C2 at 22 seconds, and then from there you cast your support from longest burst duration to shortest. Or if you're using Furina, you cast Furina's abilities before using your healer. That's enough of the emo Onoma Twink, let's move on to the slightly less emo Onoma Twink Wanderer. Scaramouche does actually get full utilization of Bennett's buff if all teammates are cast outside of Bennett's ring, and due to that, Wanderer Faruzan Bennett is generally your go-to core. And because Wanderer has lower field time and uses normal attacks, you have a lot more supports you can use. For off-field damage dealers, you have Fischl, Yulan, Furina, Jingqiu, Lynette, and Jiangling as your best options. And then for shielders or supports, you have Zhongli, Toma, Layla, Yunjin, and Mika. Now with Furina, you can also opt to remove Bennett entirely with the 1-3 Faru core that can just slot in a healer like Charlotte, Mika, or Jean. And for rotations, they are just about the same. Start with Faruzan, go to your other supports. If you're using Bennett, you want to cast characters like Fischl and Jiangling inside Bennett's burst and then go to Wanderer. Otherwise, just go from Bennett to Wanderer. So those are Mother Onomo's best use cases. Let's talk about other Onomo carries. Both of the next characters are so similar that I'll just talk about them together, and that is the two new amazing 4-star carries after Zhongyun, being Lynette and Hazel. Pre-Zhongyun, their Faruzan carry teams honestly weren't that impressive, which I'll discuss later, but post-Zhongyun, they now have a solid plunging playstyle that is very good, but quite restrictive, as it is essentially just Furina, Zhongyun, no real flexibility there. I've been using a level 80 Lynette, and for the investment she has, I'm very impressed with her clears. The rotation is very standard again, being Faruzan's combo into Furina's skill and burst, into Zhongyun's skill and burst. If you are using Lynette, then you want to burst with her, use her skill, and do 3 plunges with normal attacks in between to cancel the plunge animation, and by this time your first infusion should have run out, so you want to then recast your skill and do 3 plunges again. And with Hazel, you want to do the same thing, using his skill whenever it's up. And now the last Onomo carry to talk about is Zhongyun herself, who can put out some pretty solid clears. But again, unlike Zhao and Wanderer, you are a lot more restricted with essentially just Bennett, Faruzan, and Furina as your supports. The rotation goes with, as expected, Faruzan into Furina's skill and burst, into Zhongyun's burst, then into Bennett's skill and burst, and then Zhongyun's skill, plunge, plunge, plunge until her skill is back up. This last tier of teams are for people who really want to make their Faruzan's damage profile shine, despite the teams themselves not really being that recommended, and these last 2 teams I'm covering are Faruzan's dual carrier Quickswap teams and Thundering Fury Faruzan. With C6, Faruzan does also buff herself and she can fire off 2 hurricane arrows relatively quickly. Then during her downtime, you can switch to another Onomo unit like Lynette, Hazel, or Kazuha, who also have quite short field time requirements. Bennett is a necessity for this team, otherwise Faruzan's damage profile will lack a lot, and besides another Onomo damage dealer, you can slot in quite a few characters in the last slot, like Fischl, Jiangling, Furina, Rosaria, and so on. And in this team, you actually don't want to use Faruzan's burst immediately, due to the fact she's built with damage. You want to cast her burst inside Bennett's, as it does a relevant amount of damage. Another note for this team is that Faruzan's hurricane shots last for 18 seconds. That is a lot of time, which means that you want to start your rotations by using her skill, then you go to your supports. If it's Furina, you cast it now. If it's a snapshotable attack scaler, you cast it after using Bennett's burst. Now you want to use your other Onomo unit's abilities like Hazel's burst, Lynette's burst, Kazuha's skill and burst. Then you swap into Faruzan, fire off 2 of your hurricane arrows you activate at the start of your rotation, and after firing those 2, you can use her skill again and fire 2 more, and then go back to your other Onomo characters and finish up with them. You can also take time to funnel Bennett's skill in between swaps. It's quite a fun team. And finally, let's talk about Thundering Fury Faruzan. Faruzan has no ICD on anything in her kit, which means she can swirl a lot, and due to this and in conjunction with her C2, you can spam hurricane arrows on a very short cooldown, and if you build her with EM, she can be a very strong reaction damage dealer in AoE content. The core of this team is Faruzan, Fischl, Venti, or Kazuha, who will hold Verdescent, and you can use Aito, Furina, or Kokomi for EC swirls, or you can use Dendro units for aggravate swirls, and that will wrap up her teams. All in all, Faruzan is an excellent unit who shoots Onomo units as some of the best hyper carries through her strong buffs, and even without her C6, she is more than capable of giving you strong teams to aid you in the Abyss, whilst also enabling some fun teams with any of your favorite Onomo units, and no, she does not need 300% ER. And on that note, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Faruzan, as I'd love to hear them and respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.